Hi, welcome to Melting Pot. Today I'm in conversation with a very, very accomplished gentleman. His name is Matthias Hillner, and Matthias is currently Director of Programs, Glasgow School of Arts in Singapore, and he's also a very, very accomplished author. So thank you for joining me today, Matthias, and welcome to Melting Pot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having
me. So, Matthias, you are originally from Germany. Am I right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, great. So, you went for your education to the UK. Is that correct?
It's split. So my undergraduate was mainly in Germany, and my postgraduate was exclusively in London, UK. Yeah.
Okay, and not just your postgrad, but you are also a PhD. So I mean that's and you're so your focus is mainly design and also typography, which is, and intellectual property. You've done something in relation to that as well. So I mean, there's a lot for you to share with my listeners, and I don't know where to begin. So I'm just going to leave it to you.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe to help you a little bit along the way. It is a seemingly, well, it is a bit of a melting pot of experiences, right? But it is the best way to make sense of it, I've realized, is to look at the chronology, because there is a sort of underlying logic that I must admit I didn't always understand a priori when taking certain decisions about, new directions that I explored. But everything is actually quite logically connected. So I went through a journey starting in advertising photography, through design, communication design, multimedia design, and later other aspects of service design and innovation, which got me involved in intellectual property. So all these areas of practice are not disconnected. And I pursued this journey through sort of in parallel exploring design practice, artistic practice, as well as design teaching and learning and indeed research. So you have touched on the postgrad and PhD experiences. So these research studies, if you like, were strongly interwoven with design practices and teaching and learning activities. So these were sort of parallel streams of developments that there were a lot of synergy swinging with it, and that's crafted this somewhat seemingly complex journey.
Yeah, but also very, very interesting and fascinating. So what do you enjoy most about working within design? I know it encompasses a lot as far as you're concerned, but is there any one focus that you have?
Well, I think what I find most rewarding about the design career in inverted commas, or the personal development that you experience in conjunction with design, is that it never stops. And it never stops being interesting. So there are always new areas to be explored, new grounds to be made, and this is kind of where whenever I saw an opportunity or of new developments on the horizon, it's curiosity that drives you to explore new areas of practice, emerging methodologies, if you like. So I was the first researcher, I think, if not at least one of the first researchers at the Department for Service Design at the Royal College of Art. So once that department came into action, I was there. So I was recruited in the run-up to that. So that was very exciting to be, at the outset of something new that's happening. I also enjoyed a lot working with new companies when I did run consultancy, because there was so much that you could influence. That there was no baggage, no history that you needed to drag along. Yeah. And obviously now that I'm here in Singapore, and there's a lot of alertness towards new or in emerging areas of design and innovation practices, and that's a very exciting place to be. So I think it was curiosity that always drove me, and that actually, personally, I think you can't afford to stand still in design, because the industry and the environment is constantly reshaping. So it's a fast-moving world.
I'm sorry, and how important, obviously, technology has a very, very important role to play in this. Am I correct? So when technology kind of evolves, then, the combination of design with technology, I guess that's what you mean when you have, when you say that there's always change, there's always new things happening.
That's right. I mean, but it's not just technologies, it's also behaviors. So people, do certain things. So when Facebook was incepted, nobody asked for that sort of platform. It was just an opportunity of engagement using, existing technologies. The other thing that you've touched on my typography background. So when I started to become particularly active in that area, multimedia typography, digital typography, multidimensional typography, we were actually pressing beyond what was technically feasible. So, at the time in the early 2000s, the online bandwidths didn't cater for, heavy data load. So, myself and some of the peers that I was sort of working alongside with were actually going through very sort of tedious efforts to vectorize motion graphics in order to make them, available on screen. And now you have, high definition data, live stream through Wi-Fi systems. So it's sometimes you need to sort of project a little bit what's coming in order to be ahead of the time and be pioneering in certain areas. And now it's more about experiences and processes in conjunction with design. How can we cater for, evolving situations? So it's not necessarily tied to technology alone.
It's behavior as well. I read somewhere that in 2017, you had a solo exhibition in Singapore. Mm-hmm. I read somewhere that, again, on typography, and you mentioned that, people are, so the written word is now, people are not, I mean, I won't use lazy as a term, but people are sort of, because of the moving world so rapidly, people read less. So with typography, like emojis have happened, and you started to put in images interspersed with words, and I mean, that's my understanding. I'm an absolute layman, so if you could explain a little bit about that concept that you've mentioned somewhere. I mean, I read it somewhere. So just so that even my, listeners and viewers get an idea of what that really means.
So, yeah, I mean, my typography work really evolved out of an almost ironic statement, a visual commentary on what was happening in the early 2000s in the motion graphics scene in London and around, because there was a lot of special effects driven graphics created and disseminated, and I basically wanted to just exemplify how easy it is to have a very impressive effect on a viewer. So I I created multidimensional typographic forms and started exploring what impact it has on the viewer. You know, what's so compelling about it. But then I realized through exchanging with, you know, with the audiences that the sort of visually puzzling effect is something that is very engaging. It keeps, you know, people at suspense, and it sort of attracts their attention. So we have a natural instinct of making sense of things. So where we see patterns, we try to detect shapes naturally. And this natural instinct within humans can be exploited to say, to give them an inkling to say that there is information coming your way. And if that's a process of transition, then the pacing of the transition can be used in order to engage people over a longer period of time. And that means that less words are conveyed, but the communication process is being slowed down. But that has an impact on the quality of the reading experience. So it becomes a more memorable.
It's more imagery. Imagery and okay, yeah.
And we are naturally more attracted to imagery. And that's also something that's come about in the advent of the internet and other media devices. The more information we need to acquire or seek to acquire, the more likely we are drawn towards images. So we use an image pattern or an image in order to attract someone's attention and allow for that image to be to evolve into text information. And then that text information is perceived and retained by the viewer in a more intensive and effective fashion. So that was the idea behind that. And indeed, what happened actually at that time is that the television scene in the UK picked up on that. So a year into my MPhil study, it was in 2005 that Channel 5 launched a groundbreaking TV campaign, marketing campaign, and that led the precedent for a lot of movie title sequences and television brand assets to follow. So a few years down the line, that became a lot more mainstream, but it was all about an image that transforms into typographic information. So that was an example where I sensed something coming our way, and I managed to engage in that process creatively, but also theoretically, and guided, you know, academic colleagues as well as the industry to some extent and towards that direction. Yeah. So it's one of the examples where you can actually sound out new areas of practice, and you can become part of that sort of pioneering group of people who carve new ground.
Yeah, so that's what you mean when you say that it's ever evolving, and there's always there's always new. There has to be a newness to it, and yeah, I mean, change is always exciting, and if you are a part of the initiation of the change, then that makes it even more exciting for you. So, our intellectual property with design, because, you know, I mean, I understand with design also is creativity, correct? And so, so you've written a book, is my understanding, on intellectual property. Could you sort of tell me a little more about that, and how did that book come about, and what exactly is what aspect of intellectual property are you focused on in that book?
So the way this came, this is actually about creative entrepreneurship, and I focused on the intellectual property aspect of it within that context. And the way the interest arose in creative entrepreneurship is through my own practice. So when I was engaged in these typographic, in the specialized area of design practice surrounding multimedia typography, I secured some business development funding from the National Endowment of Science, Technology and the Arts in the UK. And in order to achieve that, I had to pitch a business towards them. So this was my first encounter with design entrepreneurship, if you like. All right, so I could start out my own design consultancy based on a successful entrepreneurial step. And so then I developed my business alongside my teaching and learning practices, as well as my research practices. But what I did also is I continued to follow the successes of other designer entrepreneurs. And I was strongly affiliated with the Royal College of Art, where I did most of my postgraduate research. And I observed that the majority of successful designers in that sphere were actually building businesses around patents. And I questioned that because patents are very cost intensive, they're very time consuming, and not necessarily by default the best way to ring fence or secure your endeavors. So I started to engage with and exchange with incubators, entrepreneurs, and also entrepreneur coaches in London and around in the rest of the UK, in order to shed some more light into what works and what doesn't, and so in the context of creative entrepreneurship. And this is how the study came to unfold. So I investigated how different designer entrepreneurs and startup teams would go about securing IP and connecting that with other significant factors. So fundraising, for instance, and establishing their businesses, which requires team building. It requires research and development and sort of also marketing to some extent. So all these different development aspects need to go hand in hand. So intellectual property is only one facet in the whole equation. And what interested me is, how does it connect, and how does it not connect very well? So the book that I've authored explores, what works and what doesn't in conjunction with creative entrepreneurship. And it explores different examples, some more successful than others. And it's really important to also touch on the pitfalls and, some of the things that didn't go according to plan. So that was quite interesting. And so the book culminates in a framework that maps out, development processes in conjunction with design entrepreneurship, but it addresses all the different development aspects in conjunction with creative businesses. So it looks at intellectual property within the context, also in the context of time, because businesses develop over time. That makes sense.
Yeah. And you've authored some other books as well. Am I right?
I've authored one book prior to that, and that was about typography in the context of multimedia communication. It talks about, also the time aspect and the perception aspect in conjunction to typography. It explores typography in the context of visual communication and fine art practice. So, looking at perception processes and how it affects the viewer's sense of time when we are engaged or immersed in a perception process. So, yeah, that's more of a philosophical nature in terms of the way it's being discussed there. Yeah.
Interesting. What would you think has been your, I'm sure, you've achieved a lot in a span of all these years, but what to your mind would be the single most sense of, achievement that you have had out of all the different projects that you've done, or out of all the learnings that you've had? Where do you think, or what do you think has been the most, like closest to your heart and something that you feel has been very, very fulfilling? Up until now, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more over the years, but up until now, is there any one thing that sort of stands out for you?
So, I mean, one of the things is obviously I'm engaged in academic management in my current and previous role. So that has to do with strategy, right? And it has to do with time. So both books, they're very different, but one of the things they're looking at is the time aspect, one in conjunction with the perception of typographic forms that evolve over time. And the other, it's looking at design entrepreneurship and creative startups as they evolve over time. And so in the academic context, we are also working along the time axis. We are developing curricula, we are developing academic strategies, and what comes into play here is the aspect of people, stakeholders who, so working with others and empowering others to achieve things from a team leadership point of view. That's one of the biggest insights for me, having been here in Singapore for 6 years now. So how to succeed in entrepreneurship, to succeed in communication, to succeed in academic, with academic endeavors, you always need to connect with other people, and you need to inspire them with your passion and your vision, and work with them in order to establish development plans and ideas and strategies that you can pursue systematically and in collaboration. So I think that's something that really stands out for me at the moment is, how do you empower people? How do you get them on board? And how do you engage them in creative processes? Yeah.
Do you think, because, you've had a very large experience in the UK, and now you've been in Singapore and Southeast Asia, do you think behavior is, a lot of it is dependent on culture and the way of thinking? Is it like different because of the cultural influences, or not necessarily?
I think that there are things that connect us all. So there is an underlying current that drives creative practices, both in an academic context as well as in a commercial context. So this is a very connected world, as we sadly come to realize, through the situation that we have in conjunction with the COVID crisis and so on. But mentalities differ, and I'm obviously helming here GSA Singapore, a small satellite campus that evolved from a collaborative engagement between the Singapore Institute of Technology and the Glasgow School of Art. So there are two academic partners that come together to behind this project, GSA Singapore. And so I'm reporting to both institutions, and actually, just minutes ago, I was liaising with, both institutions.
In regards to what's going to happen now with the sort of semi-lockdown situation again.
So that impacts us here, but the circumstances differ in both countries, because the mentality is a little bit different, and people behave differently in response to very comparable circumstances, and so that changes. And also beyond the current health crisis, if you like, there are different philosophies behind the development ideas in either of those two institutions. we are looking at one institution, the youngest university in Singapore, next to one of the most established institutions in the UK, over 175 years old, a lot of history, a lot of tradition to swings with the practices of GSA, whereas here in Singapore, we are pairing that institution with the youngest university in Singapore. So that comes with different development priorities, and it requires a lot of bridging of different mentalities and philosophies, if you like. So you could argue that in the UK you have by tendency a more traditional mindset. There's a lot to be protected, a lot of heritage to look after. In Singapore, which is even a very sort of young nation, if you like, first time I set foot in this country, they were just celebrating their 50th anniversary. So the pace at which Singapore has developed sort of historically is much faster. So there's a lot of commitment, a lot more confidence in fast-paced development, and a lot less fear of losing a certain heritage. So it's a much more future-oriented society, I would say. And so some of the things that happen here, and it starts with setting up a degree show or taking down a degree show. The pace at which things are working here is a lot more rapid by comparison to certain counterparts in the UK. And it's not just GSA, we shouldn't single them out. It's things can happen at a much more rapid pace here in Singapore than they can do in other parts of the world. And so that's interesting to observe, and that changes the range of possibilities that we have. There is no right or wrong, I don't think, but it's an interesting observation to make, as how individuals and organizations are oriented and how they also behave, because behavior is not just down to the individual, it's also down to the collective.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So I mean, you have two perspectives essentially.
Yes, and
yeah.
obviously I try to liaise between, I'm also I'm trying to connect between individuals and also between organizations and as I said earlier, different stakeholders. It's a very interesting task, not always an easy task, but it's going to be really interesting to see how we can make the circumstances change, perspectives change, and they change in different ways in different places, but yet we want to come together and work together. And to facilitate that process is not always easy, but it's very exciting.
I can imagine. Challenging, but exciting. A combination of both. So are you writing another book?
Not at the moment. Actually, I'm still dwelling on the last. It's more about, actually, I mean, a book is not, again, we have to be, that's an interesting example, actually. A book is a piece of history. And for me, what's more important is what difference it can make. So what I'm currently engaged in is a lot of conversations surrounding that book. I've just, delivered a workshop in conjunction with some of the insights explored in the book. And so my research and my theory is very much embedded in practical considerations. And so I'm currently looking at how to make use of that knowledge in a practical sense. So I'm talking to entrepreneurs and innovators. I'm talking to organizations in Singapore who embrace and promote innovation, and also academic institutions to encourage new mindsets and new opportunity and for them to embrace new opportunities and to help them along the way, so to speak. So I'm trying to put that newly developed knowledge to good use. I'm working with a partner on a platform that helps innovators and designers at a wider scale to make use of that knowledge so that it can be shared across a wider range of people and startup companies and academic institutions. So it's really about creating value and sharing that value and bringing and putting it to good use. And then
moving on. Yeah. No, it makes sense. I mean, yeah, because it's not like it's fiction writing where, you know, you've kind of put your thoughts, you've written a book, you move on. This is more on how all the effort and research that has gone into actually putting everything together, and then how to disseminate that information to more people, and how to reach out to more people is sort of is a part of the process. So it's not like you've just written the book and forgotten about it. So yeah, no, it makes sense. And how you're able to, you know, your knowledge, you're able to share and help the others with is the process. So yeah, no, that's that. I completely understand where you're coming from with that. So before I let you go, just a piece of advice that you would like to give young designers in terms of design and communications, you know, who are, I mean, you've got a whole bunch of young designers who are at the university at the moment, right? Whom you are mentoring and taking to the next level. So any advice for people out there who are listening to Melting Pot, who will be watching Melting Pot, any advice that you would have for them?
Yeah, so one is time never stands still. Everything's changing at varying speeds, if you like. So one of the things that I've really learned, and that's another thing that, you know, back to your earlier question, that I really learned here in Singapore, is understanding processes and not thinking so much in consecutive fixed situations, but understanding how things change. Change comes in terms of varying directions, and also in terms of change in pace. And understanding that really allows you to become part of a process and to potentially even drive that process, to be, you know, on top of it, in inverted commas. So that's one of the things. And the other advice I would say is, in very general terms, and I explain that in better detail, is connecting the dots. So when you look at my typography work, it's about, you know, different fragments of information or abstract information coming together. So that's patterns evolve gradually over time into text information. So this process of connecting the dots is something that we do naturally, but it is also something that we should do, generally speaking, in conjunction with everything that we do. So when it comes to, you know, problem solving, we want to connect the dots. And that's where it comes to design entrepreneurship. We need to look at the surrounding circumstances, understanding, you know, all the issues that we are confronted with, understanding how they connect with and impact one another, right? And then thinking about, you know, who is affected by it, understanding the different stakeholders and people that are part of this equation, part of the scenario, and see how they connect with the situation, and see how we can improve that situation for the benefit of all the stakeholders involved. So this is what I mean by connecting the dots. When it comes to an individual business, you've got different things that need developing: your value proposition, you know, your finances, your resources, your route to market, your intellectual property, and how these things come together in a, you know, in an effective manner, so that they don't cancel each other out or get in each other's way, how they can be managed over time and in harmony. That's a matter of connecting the dots. So understanding change, how things change over time, looking at all the moving parts and assessing them within context in the most general sense of the word. I think that would be my advice.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matthias. I mean, it's just been wonderful listening to you, and I'm sure you have a lot more ahead of you. and your guidance, and your knowledge and all of that is really also going to help a lot of people in the long run. So thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you for being on Melting Pot and chatting with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.